Good afternoon and welcome to the seminar on sources in foreign archives for the study of Portuguese history, promoted by CITSEM at the University of Porto. Earlier in March, Amandi Barros and I were forced to cancel and postpone the remaining seminars of this initiative, including Wendy Child's session, which was scheduled for the 4th of June. As you all know, the outbreak of COVID-19 has forced not only universities, but also every service to adapt to a new reality of social distancing. But the truth is that this new reality also offers opportunities of taking advantage of digital means to bring people together in other ways. So here we are here today via Zoom and the CITSEM's YouTube channel, broadcasting live to the entire world to attend Wendy Child's seminar, who's going to talk to us about English sources for the study of Portuguese commercial exchange in the Middle Ages. For those who don't know her, Wendy Child is Emeritus Professor of Later Medieval History at the University of Leeds, and she's a specialist in the economic history of medieval Europe and the international trade of England in the 13th and 14th centuries. She did her undergraduate and doctoral studies at the University of Cambridge, before moving to Leeds, where she taught medieval English and European history at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Throughout her career, Wendy Childs published some brilliant works on England's foreign trades, such as the Anglo-Castilian trade in the later Middle Ages, articles on Anglo-Portuguese trade in the 14th and 15th centuries. I have the example here of the transactions of the Royal Historical Society, where one of those articles is published, and a book titled Trade and Shipping in the Medieval West, Portugal, Castile, and England, which is the outcome of Wendy Child's participation in the first Armindo de Souza lectures organized by Jim in 2009, and this is the book, the outcome of those lectures. And you can also find sources edited by Wendy Child, such as the accounts of whole 1453-1490. Wendy Child is therefore a perfect match for these seminars on sources in foreign archives for the study of Portuguese history, which aims at providing young students and researchers with the necessary knowledge and tools to broaden their investigations with source material from institutions beyond Portugal. That's why we invited Wendy Child to talk to us about her background as historian and her contact with English and Iberian archives and sources, and to include some broad strokes on Anglo-Portuguese commercial relations in the Middle Ages, aspects related to the organization of British archives and its potential for historians, and finally to present some case studies with documents before the final debate. It will be a challenge, of course, to do all of this online, but I'm quite sure it will be worth it. And many thanks for having accepted our invitation for this seminar. Many thanks also to those who are here with us on Zoom and those watching us on YouTube. The digital floor is now yours. Let's begin, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me, for the original invitation, which I was looking forward to greatly. And I hope sometime that I will be able to come to Porto again to talk to you all. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but it looks as though this is going to work. The only person who could manage to make it not work is me if I press the wrong button, because I'm not so expert as the rest of you at this. But so, to start, and thank you very much for the introduction, which explains that I have been interested in overseas trade, England's overseas trade, for many years. And I have mostly worked from the English side, simply because the English sources, the English resources, particularly government resources, are very rich indeed. And so I have been able to do a series of pieces of work which have looked at particular commodities like iron or timber or cloth of gold, particular areas that England has traded with, Spain and Portugal, of course, but also Iceland. And so I've had quite a wide reach in terms of the trade that I've looked at. And I have drawn most of it from the English sources, apart from using mainly published sources from overseas archives, except for the ones along the north coast of Spain, which I went to rather a long time ago. There has been a lot of work done on trade. Flavio has done some. Tiago has also looked at the connections between England and Portugal. But it's not just the Anglo-Portuguese which has been covered, but there is currently a huge amount of work going on amongst economic historians in the commercial developments around the Baltic, in Central Europe, in and out of Flanders, in the Italian world as well, all of which is enormously important because it shows the network of trade which England and Portugal then operate in. What I'm going to talk about particularly is Anglo-Portuguese trade and what you can find in English sources. But the one big thing that I really want to emphasize is that for both countries, this is part of their trading network. They are part of trade routes, markets, which involve not just them, but people from all over Europe at that time. Focusing perhaps on certain nodes like Bruges in the Low Countries and then Antwerp, but actually travelling very widely. England's ships would go from the Baltic up to Iceland down to Andalusia. The Portuguese go from the North Sea out to the Atlantic Islands and Madeira by the end of the 15th century, into the Mediterranean, down the west coast of Africa. So we're dealing with a branch of trade which has its very distinctive own characteristics and its own distinctive chronology, but it's all within a very much bigger network. So my work on Anglo-Portuguese material and on the English material and the English overseas markets is actually just one small bit. I hope it's a useful bit, but it's in a really big tapestry of other researchers and other work which is being done. But anyway, my focus today is sources in England for Anglo-Portuguese commercial contacts. And I wanted, first of all, before I get to the archives and the documents, just to sketch in, very briefly, I hope, the characteristics and the chronology of the Anglo-Portuguese trade. It seems to me there are three basic elements which encouraged the trade right from the beginning: attractive commodities, ease of access, and peaceful politics. I'll just say a word about those three. In terms of commodities, they are attractive because they are broadly complementary. They don't compete with each other. England's exports are wool and cloth, also tin and lead. Now, Portugal had not much interest in English wool at all, but it was very happy to take cloth and also tin and lead. So England has got something that it can trade with. Portugal has got things which England really wants. England wants the southern type goods which it can't produce itself. So Portuguese wine, olive oil, the scarlet kermes dye for the cloth industry, all sorts of fruit, but particularly figs and raisins, the dried fruits for the winter months, cork, salt, and then in the 1480s, 1490s, the beginnings of the New World goods. We begin to see Madeira sugar coming into Bristol, and some references to long pepper and to popinjays or parrots, presumably from the west coast of Africa. All this is either not exactly luxury, but it's comforting food. You don't need wine, you don't need figs and raisins, but it's awfully nice to have them. And this is what England wants and can get. It can buy them in the Low Countries if the Portuguese take them there. It can buy them from southern Spain. It can buy them from the Italians who bring them in. But Portugal is another source, a good source, and one which the English can go to and in which they can buy themselves. And the quality of the Portuguese commodities is very good. And at the end of the batch of documents, I have quoted a little extract from a didactic treatise called The Number of Weights, which describes the goods which come from Portugal and emphasizes that the olive oil is the best olive oil that you can get, and that the kermes dye is the best kermes dye you can get. So commodities are really attractive in both directions. Ease of access, well, I really mean by that it's absolutely straightforward. You can go out of England, out of Portugal, and you can sail between the two without much in the way of obstruction. It's straightforward, and it's on a route which is reasonably well known, not only between England and Portugal, but it is a route which the Italians and others use to come from the Mediterranean up to the Low Countries. So it's a well-travelled route. It's easy enough to find good information about it. And peaceful politics is also a very considerable asset. In the early period, by which I mean, I suppose, the 13th and early 14th centuries, there's not much in the way of formal alliances, but there is friendship and there's no reason for any hostility. And then in the mid-14th century, you begin to get treaties. First, the trade treaty in 1353, which I've given as an example in the documents at the end. And also the treaties in the 1370s and 80s, culminating in the Perpetual Alliance of the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, which ties the two countries much more closely together and which lasts for the rest of the Middle Ages. So those three essentials, I think, we need to bear in mind, which encourage trade. But over the centuries, clearly the patterns do change. The patterns from time to time will shift in terms of the merchants involved, a bit the ease with which they travel, and the goods. And I'll just briefly explain what I mean by that. If we look at the 13th and 14th centuries, 13th and first half of the 14th centuries, much of the trade is in the hands of the Portuguese. It's the Portuguese merchants and ships who visit England much earlier than English ones begin to go to Portugal. The Portuguese also have quite active links with Gascony in the 13th century as well. The first clear reference that we've got to the Portuguese arriving in England is in as early as 1202, the safe conduct from King John of England, allowing them to come to England and anywhere else in his realm. So from 1202, we know that the Portuguese are coming, and there's enough documentation in the English sources to show ships and merchants fairly steadily and regularly calling at English ports throughout the next 150 years. And their route, of course, is tightened and brought more closely into the network when the Italians begin to come round from the Mediterranean to the north, quite often calling in Lisbon and carrying on further north. So becomes a busier route, and on it's the Portuguese who are much more active than the English. A change comes in the first half of the 14th century when at last English merchants begin to go to Portugal and at the same time to Andalusia. They begin to go into the southern parts of Iberia in larger numbers. Their lack before that might be something to do with us not having perhaps the right evidence or the right documents from the 1330s onwards that we begin to see evidence of their activity. And you might ask, why then? And I think there are two things which would help to explain it. England's two big markets, very easy to get to and safe, were her wool market in the Low Countries and her wine market from Gascony. Gascony was an English territory at that point. The English were privileged merchants there. So the wine trade and the wool trade were safe, close, and very, very busy. And I think this took probably the bulk of English energy. Both of them were disrupted by the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. The trades recovered. It certainly didn't, the war didn't break them up, but the violence of the war certainly disturbed the Gascoigne trade quite substantially, but also made the Flemish counts less, they're still fairly friendly, but it made them less tied to the English. They were vassals of the King of France, and they were trying to balance their English and French interests. So there was disruption within England's two major easy markets, and I think some merchants may have looked elsewhere at that time. And the second point is that this is the period when the English cloth industry begins to move forwards, and English cloth is not welcome in the traditional market of the Low Countries. English merchants were looking to other areas to sell their cloth. So I think those two factors might have helped to make the English look beyond their traditional markets and at Iberia. Another big change comes in 1369, when the politics of the Anglo-French War spilled over to include Castile, and when Castile, then with Enrique Trastamara taking over the Spanish throne with French support, becoming a firm ally of France and turning Castile into an enemy of England. And it remains a formal enemy for nearly 100 years, from 1369 through to the next Anglo-Castilian Treaty of 1466. Almost immediately, it stops trade. This is just to indicate what happens in 1369 when Spain, the Spanish ships are the red ones, showing up in English customs accounts. Spain becomes the enemy in 1369, and their ships just disappear from England altogether. When there is a partial treaty and truce in the 1390s, they reappear. But England is no longer the place that they enjoy or where they are encouraged. And what you can see quite clearly is that Portuguese activity increases there. So 1369, I think, is important because it cuts Castile off from English merchants. It makes Castile less safe for the English merchants. Castile has become an enemy. You can see what is happening in the balance between Spain and Castile in this bar chart, which is bringing wine ships. You can see it here in the customs accounts from Bristol, where you can see the bright green Portuguese ships vastly overwhelm the very small number of red Spanish ships in the bar charts. English ships and Low Country ships are still there. But you can see the shift from Spain to Portugal. 1369 does make a difference to the relationships with Castile, which is visible not only in the politics, but also in the trade. And that, I think, encourages the Anglo-Portuguese trade very strongly indeed. And it's from this time onwards that the English really do begin to grow in Lisbon. The treaties which are made with Ferdinand and then with João Avis and the Treaty of Windsor in 1386 then just firm up on this friendly alliance relationship. And the English stay very strongly in Lisbon for the rest of the Middle Ages. The Portuguese, their ships have come into England, as those bar charts showed, but they don't stay quite so strongly as one might have expected. And I think there may be two reasons for that. One is that really they are much more interested in the Low Countries. That's more important for them than England. So they've tried England, but they still prefer the Low Countries. Or it may be that the increased English competition on the route made it more difficult for them, because instead of the English being spread between Lisbon and Andalusia, they're all going to Lisbon. There are other political changes as the 15th century goes on. There's quite a substantial change in the 1450s, when we can see in the 1350s and 60s, again, another surge in Portuguese ships this time, and imports of Portuguese wine to Bristol. Again, we're taking this from customs accounts. 1453, Gascony is lost, and the Gascon wine trade, the control of the Gascon wine trade, is lost to England. And for a period, English merchants look elsewhere from Gascony to northern Spain, southern Spain, and Portugal for wine. Our customs accounts are actually not awfully good between 1460 and 1478, but they are sufficient to show that there is quite a surge towards the Portuguese in the 1460s, the 1 year 1465-6 there, before the Gascon trade begins to recover, as it does. And then in 1466, there's also a treaty with Castile, which means that Castilian ships and Spanish ships begin to increase, and the English can more easily get to southern Spain. And so you can see the red bars coming up with Spain. We can see in the 1490s that Spanish trade again surges in England, and particularly the Portuguese come into London in really quite large numbers. I think this is mostly to do with the general expansion of the European economy, and Portugal taking part in this as well as England. But whereas for much of the 15th century with Portuguese ships, one might see 6 or 7 Portuguese ships in Southampton, 3 or 4 perhaps in London. By the end of the 1490s, you're seeing sometimes 15, 18, 20 Portuguese ships in London. It's clear at that time that London is their main focus. Southampton is their stopover on the way to the Low Countries, and Bristol is not really of much interest to them, although Portugal is of very great interest to the English merchants. So that's the chronology, a sort of constant change in accordance with politics. And so my next question, of course, which will finally get us on to the sources, is how do we know all this? What are the sources like? What are we using? And for some of the bar charts, we are using customs accounts, because England has a national system which runs from 1275 onwards, a piecemeal addition of goods through the 2 centuries that I'm looking at, which provide us with the sort of information that we need for quantification, which enables us to produce charts and graphs and comparative material. But first of all, the archives and the sources in England. The best sources, I think, are without doubt the government sources, the sources of central government. There are also some municipal archives, London, Southampton, Bristol to some extent, Exeter. And there are some valuable literary and technical sources, but unfortunately for England, very few private sources, no bankers, no company records, nothing like that, which helps with Portuguese trade. But the government sources are without doubt the richest. These are the ones that are kept at the National Archives, TNA, at Kew, a collection which was formerly known as the Public Record Office, the PRO. Just to remind people, or tell people if they don't know it, the archives use 3 languages, Latin, French, and English. Latin is the most formal of the languages, And most of the diplomatic and most of the final administrative and financial summaries are in Latin. Anything which needs to be preserved, anything that is formal, goes into Latin. French was the working and speaking language of most of the court and the administrators. And so there are many less formal documents which are actually in French, the sort of letters which go from office to office or small matters of instruction are quite often in French. And finally, English begins to creep in, at least into court matters and petitions from the very end of the 14th century, and some of the legal petitions which are in my file of examples show the way that English is being used. So 3 languages, and the 3 sections of the government that I'm now going to look at: Chancery, Exchequer, Chancery. Chancery is the main writing office, and it handles all sorts of business. It's important for diplomatic material and all the general administration that the government has to do. There are hundreds of different series of documents. So I'm just going to pick out about 3 or 4 which are bound to have a lot of Portuguese material in. The first is the treaty rolls. The most obvious sources for international diplomatic relations are the treaty rolls, on which the English recorded their treaties and letters of safe conduct, licenses to trade, anything formal which had to do with foreign relations. These, luckily, have been fully calendared and published to 1325, but unfortunately and unluckily are not published for the rest of the Middle Ages. You have to go and look at them if you want to see what they contain. However, the great collection of English diplomatic material, which was made at the beginning of the 18th century by Thomas Rymer, and which is known as Foedera, did abstract a lot of diplomatic material from these documents. And so Foedera will give you the most important elements from the treaty rolls. But unfortunately, you have to go and read them if you want to see if there's anything else to pick up. The Gascon rolls, on the other hand, are now freely online in their entirety under the Gascon project. But I have been through them, and it's extremely difficult to find much about the Portuguese in them. Although the Portuguese seem to have been happy to trade in Gascony in the 13th century, they don't seem to be very interested in the 14th and 15th centuries. But that's the diplomatic side. On the general administration side in Chancery, it's the patent and the close rolls which would be of most interest, because those record all the outgoing letters from the Chancery, either as closed letters, closed and folded private letters under letters close. And they have an immense amount of material, domestic and diplomatic. You don't mind, you don't know what you might find in there. Indeed, things that sometimes you would expect to find in the treaty rolls, you will find on the patent and close rolls. And these, luckily, have been calendared and are extremely well indexed. So they would be certainly my first port of call for almost anything that I wanted to find out about what the government was doing. Because they're indexed, you can find people, you can find places, you can find subjects that you want. And from that, you can begin to work out into other sources and series in Chancery. There are various other uses as well, charter rolls and fine rolls and council and parliamentary proceedings, all of which may have what you want in, but I would certainly start with patent and close and the treaty rolls. Also linked to Chancery, there are legal matters, legal materials as well, and this is in what are called the early Chancery proceedings. I will mention, I'll come back to mention those when I talk about the law courts and legal things, but to bear in mind that an important legal source is in Chancery itself, in cases which are heard before the Chancellor. The second big section to look at is the Exchequer. And Exchequer records are anything to do with royal finance, and they're essential for the sort of quantification that the bar charts and graphs make, that I was showing earlier. They deal with a tremendous amount of domestic material, but the one important category of revenue for the kings was customs duties. These are essential for a look at English international trade, and were collected in 15 designated ports around England. The ones most important for Portuguese trade would be Bristol, Southampton and London. But the Portuguese do turn up in almost any of the small ports along the south coast, not necessarily trading. There are references to their presence there. But this is where the customs duties were collected. And this allows us to quantify trade, and it's from these that we can make the general summaries of England's total trade in wool and cloth. There are two sorts of customs accounts which survive and which give us what we want. The first are the enrolled final summaries, and it's from those, the E356s, that you can get total amounts of wool and cloth and wine. They survive from the time when the duties were put on in terms of wool from 1275 through to the end of the Middle Ages, in cloth from 1347 to the end of the Middle Ages. And they tell us what's going on in England's major export trades. They don't tell us anything about the ships, the merchants, commodities other than the big commodities that pay by the piece. For these, we need the customs accounts, which are in the category E122, which are the detailed particulars which are sent up from each port to the Exchequer to be audited and then summarised. These are the sort of a sample of the books and rolls which are sent from the centre, from the ports to the centre, and they will give you the details such as the commodities, the shipping, the merchants, the directions of trade, the values. And it's example of these which I have given in the set of documents at the end. So the customs accounts are what we need for detail. The Exchequer deals with any case, any offence against the King's revenue. So anything which goes wrong with the customs accounts, if there is smuggling or cheating or abuse of licenses, breaches of licenses and so forth, these will be prosecuted in the Exchequer court if it looks as though the King can make some money from it. So again, we have legal documents, but within the Exchequer. So that brings me just to say something about the final legal records, and that is how important lawsuits are to us. The great thing about lawsuits is that provided you've got both sides to the lawsuit, even if you've got one side, you do hear a lot, not only about what people thought should happen, but what they thought was right, what had gone wrong, and very much circumstantial details about what they've done and what their opponents have done, which tells you a lot about how businesses were run and how merchants operated together. Now, the two sources, legal sources I've mentioned, the Chancery proceedings and the Exchequer Court, are probably our most important ones for international trade. The other major legal law courts in England are the common law courts of King's Bench, which dealt with criminal matters, and common pleas, which dealt with civil matters of merchant purchase, merchant. Now, Portuguese, foreigners in England, Portuguese, Spanish, whoever they were, could all sue in the common law courts and could all be sued in the common law courts as well. But if they had any evidence which came from overseas, like contracts which were drawn up overseas, this sort of documentation was not admissible in the English common law courts in lawsuits, because it wasn't actually originating on English land. So merchants very often found themselves needing equity jurisdiction, and for that they appealed to the king, or to the king in council, or to the king in parliament. And those cases originally went to the king, but increasingly were handed on to the king's chancellor to hear. So Chancery ended up with a specialist equity court to which people could appeal when they couldn't get justice or felt that they were being badly treated in the common law courts. The other courts which are open to foreigners, of course, are the municipal courts, the mayor's courts and the city courts of London, Bristol, Southampton. But once again, if they thought they weren't getting justice, then they could appeal to Chancery and the Crown. And we get a lot of very good information about how businesses are run from the lawsuits, but we get our quantification from the Exchequer. So that really ends my run through the sources, run through the institutions for the sources. But I would just like to add at the end that we should consider archaeology, which is sometimes forgotten by documentary historians. And I'd just like to draw attention to the Newport Ship, which was a lovely wreck found, can a wreck be lovely? It was an exciting wreck found at the mouth of the River Eske, a tributary of the River Severn, just opposite Bristol. So it's something that's very close to the Bristol trade. And very careful study has shown that it was built around 1450, from timber from the Basque provinces, probably behind San Sebastian, repaired with English timber, so it's obviously been in and out of England in its life, and sank while in dock sometime in 1468-70. Again, Chronology provides us with the date, all these dates. So built in Spain, patched in England, repaired and finally sank in England. But what is important for the Portuguese trade is that the artefacts found in it included 5 Portuguese coins, little bits of pottery sherds, which were clearly Portuguese pottery, and quite a lot of the remains of prickly juniper bush from southern Portugal, which was probably used as dunnage to help pack cargoes. So this was a ship, mid-15th century, close to Bristol, in the Severn, close to Bristol, which had clearly been used on the Portuguese run. And it fits extremely well with the documentation that we have. This is a very clear indication of documents and archaeology really working together. Well, that really finishes my talk without beginning to look at the examples. What I have done as samples, just to show what you can get out of the public record, the National Archives, and how documents fit together. I've given one reference to a diplomatic activity, that's document number 1. Then I've given several examples of customs accounts, the material you can get from the particular accounts, which go up from the ports to the Exchequer, and 2 lawsuits and 2 little extracts from literary sources at the end. But it's probably the customs accounts that I need to spend most time on to explain a bit about how they work. But for the first document, the treaty. I chose this just to show that there is agreement before the Great Treaty of 1386, which is the one that the English always seem to hear about. I don't know if it's the same on the Portuguese side, but this is always seen as the Great Treaty, 1386. But there is an agreement before, and very interestingly, it is a commercial agreement, and it's not actually a full treaty between two kings. It is an agreement between King Edward III and the people of Portugal's maritime cities and coasts, although it is endorsed by the King of Portugal. But all I wanted to do with this first one is really to show how the calendar of patent rolls, the calendar of close rolls, and the treaty roll all combine to give us the information that we need, which shows that the arrangements were started about a year before, on the 25th of July 1352, when we get a list of names of ships and two merchants, Linpas and Alho, who come to England. Immediately after that, the 1st of August, we get a letter from Edward III to King Alfonso saying that he has met these people and he is agreeing that Alfonso's subjects should have security in England, and he has given safe conducts for the two who are going to come again with full powers to contract a one-year treaty. They're obviously there within the year, because the safe conduct is extended on the 5th of July 1353. So we've had patent rolls, close rolls, patent rolls again. And then we have the treaty actually made on the accepted on the 20th of October 1353. And this is interesting because although the safe conduct and the others say that they wish a one-year treaty, what they actually provide for is a 50-year commercial treaty between Edward III and the people of the maritime cities and coasts. And it is, if you look through the terms which are on the next page, it is very much a maritime commercial thing. There is nothing about the kings offering armed help, nothing about the kings not helping their enemies, nothing of the usual side, but it's that the peoples of both sides can come safely. And if they do harm each other, because people know that violence and accidents will happen, this is not to be taken as in any way a violation of the treaty. It will be all put to arbitration. This is to keep trade open. The next set of documents that I've looked at given are examples of customs accounts. So we're on to probably page 3, the examples of London customs accounts. What I'd say in general about customs accounts, I've given them here, and particularly this first one of London, to show that the Latin format is kept with the imports and the exports. I've first of all, for the ship of Thomas Martin, I have given the Latin format, and then I've given a tabulated English one after it, just to remind you that what you would be looking at in customs accounts is basically a Latin text. I've omitted putting the customs duties, which would normally go down the right-hand side. That is essential for the Exchequer, but it's not essential for us if we're looking at trade. What we want to know about are the people and the goods and the values. And if any of us want to work out the customs duties, then it's not a problem because they are absolutely standard. The money as set out in here is the old English pounds, shillings and pence. The cloth, which is exported, which comes later, is the standard cloth of the size. It is a standard piece. And the dates which are given for the ships are the dates of loading and unloading. We're fairly sure that's what this is now. It sometimes says in the documents the ship arrived on such and such a date, or the ship left on such a date. It's really the loading and unloading dates, we're fairly sure. But they will be very close to the arrival and leaving dates, and so they do allow us to see how long ships might stay in port, or how long they're away from port. What we do see with this document and all the London ones is that the information given about ships is actually rather sparse. There we have it, from the ship of Thomas Martin. Thomas Martin will be the master, not the owner. We're confident about that now. And this is the main identifier of the ship. London doesn't give the name of the ship, doesn't give the home port of the ship. It just simply says the ship of Thomas Martin, because it's the master who will, in the end, find himself responsible if the Crown wants to chase up what is going on. The merchants are ultimately responsible, but they will be found through the ship's master in many cases, because the ship's master very often acts as a proctor or purser. The incoming cargo is fairly standard, I think. Fruit, if we go down to the cargo, it's fruit and oil. But interestingly on this, it's fish oil. This is unusual, but the fruit and the wax and so forth are fairly standard. And the export is largely of cloth, as I say, the standard cloth. And that again is a very typical cargo. If we were to move on down to the end of the London extracts, we right at the end, I have put two from the 1443, the ship of John Daniel and the ship of Richard Cowes. Yes, here we are, ship of John Daniel, ship of John Cowes. Now, I've just given some little extracts from that. And this again is typical incoming cargoes of oil, this time olive oil, wine, wax. And I've put those two in because Alfred, Stitchmarsh and May turn up on both those ships. And they are players in the lawsuit, the Chancery lawsuit, which is at the end of these documents. So I've put it in so that, again, you can see how legal documents in Chancery, customs accounts in Exchequer can overlap and feed each other and help us see what's going on. Now, the next set of documents, if we move on down from these, are from Southampton. And whereas in London, one might get 4 or 5 ships on a really good year, 1 or 2 at other times, with full cargoes, what you get here, and what I've indicated here in the year 1433, is 13 ships in Southampton, but most of them are passing, like the ship of Rodrigo Janus. He's in for 3 days or so, and most of the others are in for very short times, and they're moving on. And they're moving on to the Low Countries, probably, and coming from the Low Countries. They don't often import or export large amounts of commodities. But I have put, if we move further on, I have put details of the carrack of John Alfonso. I've given you one full cargo of his, arriving. It's interesting that it's called a carrack for Portugal. Portugal has obviously got some very big ships as well as some quite small ones. So I've given you the full cargo there, and you can see most of the shippers are native Englishmen, but there are some Portuguese amongst them. The cargo is not big, but what is happening with this carrack is that it's sailing on out to the Low Countries and back again. And if we move from this full cargo, if we move on to the next page, I think it's on end of page 6 and then page 7, I've put in the arrival and leaving dates of the ship, and you can see that it comes in and out. On the 2nd of May, it comes in again, and clearly from its cargo, it's coming from the Low Countries, bitumen, haberdashery, tiles. This is Low Country cargo. It then goes out on the 6th of May, presumably to Portugal with its cloth, cargo of cloth. And it's back on the 16th of September, must be from Portugal. This time, look at the cargo of wax, oil, vinegar. Iron is a bit odd. It's only about a ton of it, but that is a typical Portuguese cargo. It goes out again, or it must go out because it comes back again. No outward cargo recorded, but when it comes back again, it's got a Low Country cargo. You've got herrings and bitumen coming in. So I think what you've got here is a very clear indication of a ship from Portugal to the Low Countries, which is calling into Southampton, doing a bit of trade, but doing the main trade further up in Bruges. And the next two ships that that I've put on there are examples of ships which have a great deal of fruit on them, very much the winter cargo of figs and raisins. I've then moved on to give you some rather different information from the Bristol accounts, which are on pages 8 and 9. And I haven't given you cargoes here. I've just given you some of the names and dates of sailing of the ships. Now, in Southampton, as well as London, what you were given was just simply the master's name, the carrack of John Alphonse, the carrack of somebody else. What you get in Bristol is wonderful in that you get the name of the ship and its home port and its destination or its last port of call. So whereas with the London and Southampton ones, we're having to say, yes, I think it's coming from Portugal. The names sound Portuguese, the cargo is Portuguese. It's probably not from Andalusia because the politics wouldn't allow it. What you get in Bristol is a statement. The Nicholas of Bristol went to Lisbon with its Irish master, Dennis Galway, and it came back from Lisbon on the 24th of January. There, next side of it, again, same ship. And you can trace ships out and in, with much more confidence because you're given the name and the home port as well as the master. And from this you can see how long they spend away from port and how much time they spend with turnaround in port. This is 1480. This is a different political situation from the earlier ones of London and Southampton, because by now, after 1466, the Spaniards have made another treaty with England, and Spanish merchants and shipping is coming into England alongside the Portuguese and the English ships on Iberian voyages. And you can actually see in this list that as well as Portuguese, mostly English ships, some Portuguese ships, there are also one or two of the Basque countries which are entering into the Lisbon trade. But it's because of this information about where ships are going and where they're coming from in these sorts of documents that one can make the bar charts which I made about where the wine is coming from. I can do this for Bristol because you have the destinations and last ports. You can't do that with the same sort of confidence at London or Southampton. You're much more guessing. But it's from this sort of information that we build up our patterns of who's trading, where they're trading, with what ships they're trading, what their goods are, and they are absolutely essential. Very, very briefly, I'll just turn to draw attention to the two lawsuits. These are complicated, so I'm not really going to talk through them, and I hope that people who have them will take the time to look at them in more detail. But just to draw attention to them, these are ancient petitions. This one is an ancient petition. The other one is a chancery C1, an early chancery proceeding. They're both chancery documents. They're both appeals which are made to the king for justice and end up being heard by the chancellor. Just to make the point, the man called John of Port, who is a Lisbon merchant, took one whole year trying to get justice for himself. I think he probably got it. The documents show that he was suing in ancient petitions. He tried again. He didn't get justice, so he sued again to the Chancellor, and the document is in early chancery proceedings. We know from that he actually got people charged in the Court of King's Bench, and you can look that up online. And finally, we know that he managed to get himself a special special inquiry into his case, and that is on the calendars of patent rolls. So we've got ancient petitions, we've got early chancery proceedings, we've got King's Bench, and we've got patent rolls all feeding into this case. And after he got his special formal commission of inquiry into his case, the documents are silent. And I think he probably did finally get his compensation, because it's quite clear that the courts are in his favour. It's just that they can't get the offenders to cough up the money. So I think he probably did get it. But his petition is in English. So there you have a nice example of 15th century English, in which he explains what has happened, that he's bought his cargo, he's been robbed in Dartmouth. Those who robbed him of his goods tried to stop him getting to London. They beat him up and imprisoned him on the way to try and stop him getting justice in London. But I think he got it in the end. It's a fairly straightforward case. The final one I just want to draw attention to is immensely complicated, and I think one could probably spend a whole hour on it, and I think probably if I can do it in 30 seconds, you'd rather have that than the whole hour. This is, again, Latin in part, and starts with actually a Latin memorandum where Henry May asks the Chancery Court for a memorandum of what's happened so far, and what the court does is produce it for him in Latin. So we get the court, we get the first details actually in Latin. We go on to both the list of goods and the petition, for later petitions, which are again in English. I'm not quite sure how I can really pare this down, but the essence is that the Portuguese merchant was robbed by a pirate in the Channel. Henry May's ship helped him, restored his goods, and sailed away. The pirate again took the Portuguese ship for a second time and sold goods in England, took the goods to England and sold them. At this point, Velo, the Portuguese man, asks Henry May, who has previously helped him, for help and willingness to testify in English courts to try and get return of the goods. Henry is willing to do this, so Henry and John themselves are perfectly at ease, and they are going through the legal forms to try and get the goods back. Unfortunately, the Portuguese man's partners in Lisbon want to shortcut the system, and they try to get compensation from the goods of Henry and Richard May, which are, Richard is then in Lisbon. So they sue and imprison Richard May for what they say is Henry May's fault in Lisbon. That unfortunately brings Henry problems in Bristol and London, because Richard was at the time loading a ship, his cargo, on a ship in Lisbon, an English ship, the George Heron, which was then, because he was sent to prison, 5 weeks late in getting away from Lisbon, and 5 weeks late according to the contract which Richard had made with the owners. The owners, therefore, sued Richard and Henry for compensation for making their ship late in Lisbon. So the original case, which is going on in England, spawns 2 other side cases where the partners of the Portuguese merchant and the owners of a ship which Richard are losing sue them to try to get quicker compensation or to get compensation. And I think this is probably something which is going on in the commercial world all the time. If people want compensation, then they sue. And some of these merchants probably have 2 and 3 lawsuits trickling on at the same time, where things have gone wrong, not necessarily through anyone's fault. I think those are the points that I wanted to make about that very complicated case. It is that the 2 people who are essentially concerned, the Portuguese John Velo, as the English call him, and Henry May, are well disposed to each other. They don't particularly want a lawsuit, but it's their colleagues and their companions who can see themselves losing for completely different reasons, who want to sue. It tells us quite a lot about what's going on between the merchants, and it shows in this case that Henry has got very good, close relationships with London merchants whom he suggests would help John Velo. And I've put a few notes about these men at the bottom to help explain the case. Well, I have, I'm afraid, gone on. This is considerably longer than you probably wanted me to talk. But the customs accounts, I think, are really important. And the lawsuits are important but complicated. But finally, at the end, I've just put in the Libel of English Policy, which is extremely well known, a political poem which talks about the commodities of Portugal and what it says. They send oil, wine, osy wax and grain, figs, raisins, honey and cordwain are exactly what you find on the cargoes we've been looking at. And the number of weights, which I mentioned before, talks again about the chief merchandise being sweet wine, and it gives a range of types: bastard, capric, osy, raspy, ripitage and land wine, and also olive oil, which is the wholesomest, the best for man's meat and medicines. And when it's old, it's Exchequer's wool. Then there's wax, honey, dates, figs, pomegranates, oranges, litmus, pine sanders, and the best grain that there is to grain cloth with, the Kermes grain, the very best grain that you can get. So as far as England is concerned, Portuguese trade and Portuguese commodities are something that they want and something that they will regularly go to Portugal to get. I think that's all I have to say. If there are any questions, then I will happily answer them if I can. Or if there aren't any questions, then I should be satisfied that I've told everybody everything they want to know.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy. One of the unfortunate things about these Zoom conferences is that we cannot all at the same time clap our hands. It will be very weird, but I think I can talk in the name of everyone. Everyone's very happy, I think, with your presentation. It was a wonderful overview of Anglo-Portuguese trade, 2.5 centuries almost of Anglo-Portuguese trade, how it evolved, and how can researchers actually study these connections by going to the archives and looking at different types of sources, different typologies that can provide information for us to assemble the different pieces of this puzzle. So I will immediately open the floor for the debate. I don't know if any of the participants in this Zoom call want to ask you a question.
May I, Flavio? Yes. So again, Wendy, I would, because I have to leave in 5 minutes or so, I would like again to thank you this wonderful talk, but also, if you allow me to just challenging you a little bit more. It is clearly unfair because you told us so much about sources and informations and trends, but as an early modern historian, I always see also the medieval ages with a kind of similar patterns. So I would have 2 questions for you. First, besides the presence of those Portuguese merchants in their merchant and maritime activity, do you see really partnerships between the Portuguese and the English merchants? And the other thing which in fact is connected with this, and maybe in the even in the legal documents, it can be across that kind of information, were the Portuguese some kind of intermediaries between Low Countries trade and England, or they were just, I mean, it was part of their own business, bringing those kind of products. So it's just that, and thank you so much for your wonderful talk, which I am sure we are going to repeat in Porto with other subjects.
Thank you very much. Yes, as far as the partnerships are concerned, one can find within the English documentation plenty of indications of English and English being partners and part of a small family firm and partnerships. I can see plenty of examples of Portuguese and Portuguese being partners because they are jointly responsible for goods and acting jointly. I cannot offhand think of an indication of any instance. I don't know if Flavio knows or Joanna. I can't think of any in which I can find a Portuguese and an Englishman actually as partners within a trading concept. They help each other, they advise each other. I can't see any reason why they shouldn't act as partners, but I can't actually think of an instance at all. And in terms of the Low Countries and England, I think they're being both. I think they are intermediaries in that they are bringing low country goods to England and they are selling them here. Relatively small amounts, but the bulk of that trade will be in the hands of the English and the Low Country people and the Hanseatic merchants. So they are very small intermediaries in that they're feeding in the low country goods into England. But I think mainly it's a bit incidental. I see these Portuguese ships coming in and out of Southampton as probably stopping halfway because the weather is not so good. You need a bit of a rest. You take on some supplies. And in some cases, they sell such small amounts of goods that I think they're probably selling enough to get supplies for the ship to carry on or to maybe to pay for repairs for the ships. Instances where the commodities they sell are perhaps £1, £2, £3 are very small. If they come and unload £40 worth of goods, then I think that's a reasonable trading deal. So I think for your question, I would say yes, both. It's incidental and it's intermediary in different ships at different times.
Thank you.
Once again, many thanks for doing this for us. It was very important, I think, for everyone, and I hope it's something that young students will remember and use for their future research. Thank you, Wendy, very much. Thank you all of the participants here via Zoom, but also on YouTube. Thank you, Hirokazu Tsurushima. It's so late in Japan.
Time to go to bed, actually.
Time to go to bed.
Yes, 1 o'clock.
So bye-bye, and hopefully we'll resume these conferences in September, October with other guests. I still don't know if it's going to be with people in a room, probably not, or if we're going to do it this way via Zoom. But you are all invited for the next sessions, and I'm going to share information about it soon. Okay, thank you very much, and thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.